Hello, welcome to what is the first episode of the book club, which will be a monthly program where we interview authors about the books that they've written, how they came to write the books, and what some of the issues are that are brought up in these books. I am so honored and pleased to have as our very first guest Miss Rae Meadows, who is on with us today from her home in Brooklyn, New York. I'm going to let her introduce herself in a moment, but she has written a book called Winterland, which came out in 2022. It's one of several books she's written, but I believe this is the most recent. And it is just a wonderful, wonderful book. I'm also going to have her introduce us by giving a brief synopsis of the plot without giving spoilers. And then we will talk about some of the characters and issues. So, Miss Meadows, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure. I am an author. Winterland is my fifth novel, but I came to writing a little later than a lot of writers I know. I was in college, and a lot of other people were sleeping outside to get fiction writing workshops, and I didn't really know what that meant, and I was scared by the whole thing. So I never did it. I never tried it, even though I was a big reader. It wasn't until I was a little bit older in my later 20s that I took a class, a kind of an adult writing class. I was in the Bay Area at the time, and it really changed my life. It for me connected to something that I felt like was missing. And so after that class and meeting a great teacher, I went back to graduate school and really pursued writing. My first novel was called Calling Out, and it took place in Salt Lake City. And my second novel was called No One Tells Everything, which was kind of a darker novel. And then I wrote a book called Mothers and Daughters, which also came out. It had two different titles, oddly, but as Mercy Train. And then after that was a novel that took place in the Dust Bowl called I Will Send Rain. And those preceded this book, which it feels like, I mean, every novel feels personal, but this novel feels particularly personal. I just threw myself into the research of it, and it's a topic, many topics kind of came together for this book. This is a slight aside, but one of the things that I do sometimes when I'm working on a book is kind of, I have some disparate interests and things that have caught my attention or things that I'm obsessed with. And then sometimes I just smash those things together and see what happens.
Well,
So
that's one of the things that strikes me as you were talking is indeed that when you mentioned the word disparate, because it sounds like all of your books are very different.
very
Some
different.
authors sort of get on a train and they just stay on the train, but you've sort of been
Yeah,
exploring a lot of different areas.
a lot of different areas. And the past few books have been historical fiction, which I didn't necessarily start out to do, but that just happened to be kind of where my interests led me. And it's funny because when we think about, I mean, I grew up when the Soviet Union was still in existence, so I don't think of it as historical fiction, but it is very much historical fiction now that we're in, 2025. That period of time is one that, it's a place that in theory no longer exists. It had a set time frame for when this
And we're
experience.
going to talk about that. It's a very
Yeah.
vivid picture of Soviet Union in the 1970s. Give us just a brief synopsis of the book, because some people may not have read it yet, and I hope they will, but without necessarily, as I said, giving away spoilers, because there's a lot that happens in the book.
Yeah, I mean, Winterland to me, it follows the character of Anya, who's a child, and she lives in a town called Norilska, which is in the very Arctic north of the Soviet territory. And it follows her journey as a young gymnast in the state system and kind of what happens to her, who she meets. She ends up meeting another gymnast that is based on, which I'd love to talk about too, based on a real historical
Mhm.
gymnast called Elena Mukina. But I think for me, it's also an exploration of living in an inhospitable landscape and how people adapt and survive, and both in the smaller kind of extreme weather conditions of the town they live in, but also the Soviet Union and its kind of repressiveness and the way that Anya's life unfolds in this regime.
You mentioned a moment ago that this book perhaps was more personal than others. What about what made it more personal? What made you think about writing this book?
Well, I had never considered writing about gymnastics. I think sports novels are hard because there's so many uh, tropes and platitudes that sports fall into often. And with gymnastics, it tends to be a sport about younger girls because that's when the kind of the height of girls' abilities, occur for the sport. And so it was hard for me to imagine an adult novel that had weightiness that was about a gymnast. And so I initially started out writing a different novel and had just a minor character as a former Soviet gymnast. And I had been a gymnast as a child, and I grew up watching those Soviet and Eastern Bloc gymnasts of that period, and they were so extraordinary. And it's something you won't ever see again because the sport has changed a lot, but they were incredibly graceful. And part of what I wanted to explore was they came out of a very brutal system, and this beauty that came out of that system is hard to reconcile sometimes. But I became obsessed with. I went back and watched all the old videos of the competitions and of these gymnasts, and one of the amazing things about the internet now is that you can and also with the fall of the Soviet Union is I had access to old Soviet training videos of gymnastics, which were never available, and um, truly fascinating to watch. I don't speak Russian, but I did take Russian. I mean, I studied Russian for many years. I can't say that I speak it, but I'm familiar enough with it that I was able to kind of, I can read Cyrillic a little bit, so I felt like I could gain a little bit of access to some of the materials that I came
How
across.
far, just in terms of your own gymnastics, at what
Yes.
level did you reach? And
I was not at all the level of these girls, but my daughter is a competitive gymnast, so I have seen the dedication and what it takes and the effects on the body and all those things. And she's still in it. She's now 14, but it's very tough and it's something that exacts a lot of through injuries and
well,
uh,
that is interesting because we're going to talk about some of that, but it's interesting just knowing what you know about gymnastics now at a more elite level. How do you
yeah.
feel about your daughter being involved in it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I will admit to I love gymnastics. I'm a huge gymnastics fan. I actually still do gymnastics. I went back in my 40s
Oh my.
and I do it all the time. It's a little bit my kids will kind of roll their eyes because I'm a little bit obsessed with it. And so I have loved watching my daughter. She is not on a I never I think safe to say I never would have chosen there's a different path to choose if you're going to go to the high elite level. She's someone who's very good and potentially will compete in college, but she did not, I think one of the things at this level, if you want to go at that level in the United States, you have to homeschool and be in a full-time gym all the time. And that's not anything that I was
Well,
interested in.
speaking of which, getting back to the novel, in
Yeah.
fact, Anya's life gets taken over
Yes.
by the system and by her own desire to become
Yes.
a national caliber international gymnast.
Yeah.
She begins at around age 8.
Hmm.
She is obviously has a lot of natural talent, but she gets selected one day by the local coach, and then gets into the process. How does it talk about what she goes through over the years of her training? We see her until she's about what age do you think the book is?
Well, we see her through gymnastics through about 18, and then we
Yeah,
see her later in her
yeah,
30s.
at the very end. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I will say there's not many state systems left other than China. But the state system of the Soviet Union at the time was very much kids were chosen very early, and they were basically taken away from their families. This became tied with nationalism and duty, and it's not really a choice. I mean, I think that these kids who show talent, they in the case of Anya, the character, she is very talented, but she also doesn't really have a choice. There's both economic reason, her father's given money for her to do it. It allows her to have a different life than she might have. And she also is fully, it's a hard line to walk because she also is very ambitious for herself.
It's interesting because you do she has a young friend, Saveta, if
Sveta,
I'm
yeah.
saying it right,
Yeah.
who about the same age, and they're friends, 8 years old, and Savetta's also has some natural talent, but does not get selected. And her own life in this sort of dreary, depressing industrial town goes in a very different and unfortunate direction. So you see what potentially Anya could have become
Yes.
had she not gone in the route of being selected.
Yeah, and I loved writing the character Sveta because I think that she is exactly what you said. She kind of shows what a life could have been, and also the what comes into play. She's not chosen because of her father's political
Mm.
that he is kind of fallen out of favor in the Communist Party, and so the kind of trickle down effect to Sveta is that she is not allowed to be chosen for this kind of gymnastics path.
Two forces are non human forces are very present in the book. One is just this town, this small industrial city way up in Siberia, and the other is the weather, which you mentioned.
Yeah.
Talk about the town. Did you travel to Siberia and see one of the? Because it's so vivid, your
I,
description.
well, thank you. It's funny, this town really does exist, and that it is ranked as one of the most polluted places on Earth.
Oh,
It really is
terrible.
it's terrible. And the health effects, I'm sure, are just, I mean, they're not necessarily reported accurately, but they're bad. But it does offer, because it has this kind of natural resources of nickel and copper and palladium, that there are jobs there. And so it's a town that has about 175,000 people now. It really was built by Gulag forced
Yeah.
labor. It was just a
Now,
place.
did you see it? Did you actually travel there?
I didn't. It's what's called a closed city, and that you're not allowed
Mhm.
to go to it. Certainly, foreigners aren't allowed. I would be curious, certainly, but no, I was not allowed. But I did read a lot about it, and I looked at a lot of photographs. For me, photographs mean so much to me in the kind of research process, and to see those photos of people who live in Norilsk and what the environment looks like with
Well, in reading the book, you can almost see it, you can almost smell it,
oh,
really.
thank
Your
you.
description
Yeah,
is very vivid. Now, the weather,
yeah.
maybe more than any book I can remember reading, the weather becomes a character in this novel because it is
Yeah.
so oppressive, so ever present in people's lives, living on the extremes of temperature and no light. The winters are, of course, dark much of
Yeah.
all day long. Tell us how that affects the characters and the book.
I mean, it's rather incredible to me that people can live how they do. The novel before this was set in the Dust Bowl, and I'm very interested in that, in the kind of extreme weather backdrop to human drama. And I think in this case, the cold is so extreme that it forces people to be inside, and there's no light. And then there's this very brief period where it's light 24 hours a day, and it's almost like people live for this time, and then they have to go back
Mhm.
into living inside, and um, it's it seems a terrible way to live, but people make different choices. And in this book, a lot of people who founded this town were forced to live there, and then they end up just staying.
Right.
And yeah, and I think it is its almost its own character, and for Anya, it represents this kind of almost prison-like atmosphere for her, that she wants to, when she starts doing gymnastics, she sees a way out.
Right. And the brief periods when as she goes through the ranks and becomes a national gymnast, she gets to go to some places that are much more westernized, as it
Yes.
were, and more hospitable. Um,
Yeah.
her parents, Yuri
Yes.
and Irina, I'm sorry,
Katerina.
Yuri and Katerina
Yes.
are her parents, and now they have come out to this country when they were much younger and idealistic in a time of the Soviet Union when people were apparently more idealistic.
Yeah.
Um, but things changed. Talk about each of them.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things in researching the book that I found quite moving and surprising was the amount of optimism that people had at the time. That there were these, that Yuri is someone in this happened a lot, of who volunteered to go to this outpost in Siberia because he believed in the Soviet experiment. He believed it was good for the people. He was just a believer. And the fact that despite the kind of oppressiveness of living in the Soviet Union, there were a large amount of people who were believers, at least for a time. And so Yuri and his wife Katerina, who had been a ballerina, go up to Norilsk to settle and to do what they believe is right under the party and for the country. But Katerina, who had been a high level ballerina in the Bolshoi, she starts to lose her belief, and that becomes a rift within the couple, and she starts seeing the cracks of what the Soviet experiment can do, and then she meets Vera, her older neighbor who had been in a gulag camp, and starts to see the horrors of what some people went through. And in the Soviet Union, it's unknown really how many people went through the gulag system of the forced labor camps, but they estimate it's about 15 million. So it really
We'll
was.
talk about Vera in a moment, but with Katerina, you mentioned
Yeah.
she'd been with the Bolshoi, this character, this Anya's mother, and really she had given up this dream of her own uh,
Yes.
to continue to be a ballerina. It's in her soul,
Yeah.
and it's a real. She begins to change, as you say. I won't do a spoiler with her because, and it's still somewhat mysterious the ending,
Yeah.
um, but that's okay that it's left like that. But
Yeah.
uh, I found that Yuri was a tragic figure because he begins to become an alcoholic.
Yes.
His health goes. And he's stuck in working in a mine where his clearly is going to have a low life
Yeah.
expectancy.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and he's
He was
fighting
a
to keep
tragic.
his illusions about the Soviet Union, but he's fighting a losing battle at that point.
Totally. And he is a tragic figure. And I felt for Yuri.
Yeah,
I think that there were a lot of people in the Soviet Union when after the Soviet Union fell that felt very lost. They no longer had this kind of larger idea that they could believe in, and things fell apart, and what they had thrown their life into believing really didn't, there was nothing behind it. And I think with Yuri, he hangs on to the bitter end to what those beliefs were, even as he sees that it's coming to an end, and that his health, starts to go, and it's hard. And one of the, he in the later part of the book when he is older, the Soviet Union falls just before he's supposed to retire and have his, state pension, and it just he's kind of left with very little.
yeah, nothing except vodka
Yes, yeah,
and a nice woman who he finally.
yes,
Uh,
yes.
um, Anatoly, if I'm pronouncing it right, uh,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
coach, is the local coach in the city who becomes Anya's coach. I found him one of the most interesting characters in the book because he's rather brutal in his techniques, but there's a certain sympathetic side to him that
Yeah,
he doesn't come across as one-sided or one-dimensional. Talk about
yeah.
Anatoly.
I love I loved writing Anatoly because for exactly those reasons. He is someone who he's complicated, and in some ways he is brutal in his techniques, but he's also a product of a system that's all he knows. And I also believe that he cares about Anya, even if he can't show it, and even if he's wrong in the way that he kind of misdirects that caring. But I think in the end, she for him was his life's work. He saw her potential, and he didn't go about it in the right way, but I think he really did care for her. And I just think the relationship is an interesting one where you have a coach and an athlete, but an athlete who's really young and who it's a strange dynamic, and it's something
There's
that
in some of these sports where the girls in particular, and
yeah,
sometimes boys, start out so young. We
yeah,
see some moments when things could have gone really badly for her, and Anatoly sort of steps in. One is there's a doctor
yes,
who is uh, sexually interested in these young girl at
yeah,
gymnasts, and
yeah,
Anatoly steps in to protect Anya and
hmm,
says you won't be seeing him again.
yeah,
That's critical, I think.
yeah,
And um, yeah, I mean, and there are other times when he sort of steps in try and protect her. There's one we've also heard about some of these relationships which become sexualized between coach and gymnast.
Yeah,
And there's
yeah,
one very brief moment, again, no spoilers, where something
yeah,
like that could have happened, but it doesn't. And in a very realistic way, it doesn't. And after
yeah.
that, it's never really an issue.
Yeah, thank you. I really did not, obviously gymnastics, as we know now, has been rife with sexual abuse and all sorts of terrible things. And I didn't want this to be that book. I think that those undertones are there and disturbing, but that wasn't going to be the main thrust of Anya's story or even her relationship with the coach. I didn't really want that to kind of be the story because I think their dynamic is more interesting and intricate than that.
Yeah, he has his own hopes and dreams. So,
Yeah, yeah. I think later, there's a scene in the book where he says to her, "I gave you my life," and she says, "I gave you mine." And I think that is right. I think that that is accurate in all its kind of sadness and
yeah.
everything else.
There's one other character who is fascinating and poignant, and that is Vera. Talk a little bit about Vera. Who is Vera?
Well, I'll tell you where the idea for Vera came from. I saw some photographs of people who lived in Norilsk, and one was this very old woman, and it said that she had lived in the Norilsk camp for 10 years. And I was fascinated by that, the fact that she had stayed in the town, even though she had been sent to this terrible labor camp. And so that to me was the inspiration behind the character of Vera. And I think you can't talk about the Soviet Union without talking about the system of the Gulag and the forced labor that happened um, during Stalin's time and after. And Vera to me was the perfect vehicle for that. She's also someone so she is Anya's neighbor and she shows Anya love in a way that no one else in her life shows her because her mother has disappeared when Anya is quite young. So Vera to me is kind of the center of warmth and love for Anya while still possessing these memories and the experience of having her husband and child die in the gulag and having herself live
Oh,
there for
it's
10 years.
absolutely heartrending, her story.
Yeah,
And I think you mentioned earlier 15 million. It does occur to me in that era of World War II that so much attention has been, of course, focused on Hitler and the Nazis and the
yeah,
concentration camps. But people overlook the fact that Stalin was an absolute monster. He murdered
absolutely.
millions of his own people,
Yeah,
imprisoned
and
and tortured.
caused,
Yeah.
forced famine and all that.
And
And
often with no explanation, people were just rounded up because someone said something about them, maybe a personal grudge or something, and
yeah,
off they would go for the rest, into these gulag prisons where,
yeah,
where it was almost a death sentence.
yeah. I mean, it's truly astonishing. And the amount of just the sheer number of people that were sent is just
Well, as
mind-boggling.
Stalin once said, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. I think he was
Yeah.
quoted
Yeah, yeah,
saying,
yeah.
you realized what that came to mean in the Soviet Union. So
Yeah,
Vera
and
is a very poignant
oh,
person.
thank you. I mean, I think that one of the things I found interesting in reading about people who had been in the Gulag too is that people didn't talk about it. They came out and never talked about it. And it's not until not that long ago that people started to tell at all what their experience was like because it was so filled with shame. Even if they were sent there for no reason, there was like that was the goal is to make people feel shameful about it. And so they didn't
Yeah.
talk about it.
You mentioned that you speak some Russian.
Yeah.
It's interesting. There are sentence or two here and there that are in Russian. You don't actually give the translation, so
Yeah.
it gives it a verisimilitude, reality that people really are speaking Russian to each other.
Yeah, it's a hard thing. I mean, I also don't want it to didn't want it to feel too oppressively like you don't know what's
Yeah.
going on. But I like that idea to kind of give it a little bit of just so you hear it a little bit what that they aren't actually speaking English and that it is very distinct.
Going back to gymnastics, of course, we talked about your daughter and your own
Yeah.
interest in it. There was a transition, and I remember, of course, when Olga Korbut, Nellie Kim, Ludmila
Yes.
Trusacheva uh, came in 1972 was the transition point for women's gymnastics, where
Yeah.
it went from the very artistic, maneuvers of Larissa Latnina, I think, which is who's into the more
Yes.
acrobatic uh, uh, regimens of Corbett and others.
Yeah.
Um, so talk about that a little. But of course, now that led into Nadia Comaneci and then to
Yeah.
Simone Biles at this
Yeah.
point.
I mean,
How do
yeah,
you see that evolution of gymnastics? And I guess I would ask this question because someone wanted me to ask this. Um, has it become too dangerous? And I guess you can talk a little bit about Elena in the book, just
yeah,
without spoilers, but
yeah.
has gymnastics for both boys and girls become too dangerous in some ways?
I will say one of the things about the old gymnastic system, it was, and you see a little bit about this in the book. Certainly in the Soviet Union, they did everything to keep girls from going through puberty. So they wanted girls to be, prepubescent when they did gymnastics. And it is true that it is easier to do gymnastics when you're smaller and when you, um,
And Anya receives injections, which I assume were puberty blocking type
yeah, and kind of
injections.
painkillers and all sorts of things they
Yeah.
were doing. And I will say that there is something really beautiful about that time, like a very graceful, um, dangerous, for sure. But the, to me, that era embodied kind of a combination of athleticism and kind of grace. Now, gymnastics, I will say that athletes in general in gymnastics now are stronger and shifting older than they were, and in that way, I think healthier. Is it too dangerous? It's very dangerous. It is a dangerous sport, and it's something that I think about a lot. You actually see the most injuries coming off of the bars. The top bars is where a lot of injuries happen. I've seen a lot of injuries. My daughter's been injured. It is dangerous, and so there is a question of what is, what is the limit there and what is the purpose. I don't think that we'll see another Simone Biles. I think she very much is her own phenomenon. And because of the nature of the way that I think gymnastics has changed in the coaching has been problematic for a really long time. And I think that things are changing. And if you don't have that kind of state control or even the abusive coaches, you're not going to see quite the level of pushing towards higher end than you might have before. I feel like it's moving in a safer direction, in an older direction. And I mean, I actually very enjoy watching college gymnastics a lot because the level is not as high as elite level gymnastics, and yet it's high enough to really appreciate it.
Really, it comes down to judging, doesn't it? Because you hear
Yes,
Anatoly said we're going to have to add new
yeah,
maneuvers, new skills in order
yeah.
to get more points.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting to think about the way that the Russian, I mean, Russia cannot compete internationally now because of the Ukrainian war. So Russian athletes can't compete. But to watch how the Russian athletes have changed from the time of the Soviet Union, they kind of lost. I mean, there are some great Russian gymnasts, but it is not at all the program that it had been.
What do you think that must be like for the athletes in Russia now who have begun at
Oh,
age 6 or 7 and now they're realize their narrow window of competing internationally is ended?
Oh, it has to be devastating. And I don't really know what the option is. I mean, I assume there is some sort of like emigration option, but it's got to be devastating. I think to lose your one chance if that's what you've given your life for because of what your your whatever you call Putin is the decisions that he's made.
This is a more general political question, but you have
Yeah.
looked and studied the Soviet Union and Russia. What do you think will happen in the next 5 years in Russia? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Gosh, I'm certainly no Russian expert, but I do find it interesting that Putin is very much a product of the Soviet Union and he retains that. It was almost like it was underground for a little bit, and now the kind of authoritarian, I don't even know what his model is anymore, but there do seem to be more elements of state control and brutality and cracking down of everything in a way that is reminiscent of the Soviet system. So I don't know. I mean, certainly now with Trump, it's hard to really know kind of what that world stage is going to be. But I wouldn't personally feel comfortable going to
Well, I was
Russia.
going to say, I don't think it
Yeah,
would be advisable to research
yeah,
any books right now in the Soviet Union and then
no,
Russia.
totally. I have my doctor is Russian, and she grew up in the Soviet Union, and she was talking about how um, one of the things that she appreciated about the book was that there were, to her, even having left, there were good things about it. And I think that that's one of the things that people kind of glorify now, and Putin glorifies, that there were some good things about the Soviet Union for a little while. My doctor was saying one of the things that they did really well was early education, health, and this was a country that still actually has a really high poverty rate, but at the time was incredibly poor. And so it did manage to kind of do some things well, even in the face of doing some really
Now it
terrible
seems
things.
more ginned up patriotism without all of the some of the
Yeah,
better qualities that you
yeah,
mentioned. Yeah.
yeah, totally.
Um, I have another question that someone had asked me to
Yeah.
ask was what was the first, and I may ask each of our guests going forward, what was the first book in your life that made an impact, and how did you find that book?
Oh my gosh, that's such a great question. Um, you know what? I will say the book, and this is maybe a little later that it came to me, but the book that changed me as a reader, and then has stuck with me as one of my favorite books, is To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, which I read in college. Um, I became a reader in college. I had read books, but I was not a reader, and I was not a lover of literature until college. And that book to me, which I just reread recently, totally holds up. Um, it moved me in a way that I didn't no literature could do before that. And so it's almost like this talisman for me, that book, it means a lot to me, and there's something in it about creation, about creating, and I don't know, I find it
Well,
incredibly
that's
moving because,
lovely. And
yeah,
maybe people are going to have to read that
yeah,
after they read Winterland, they'll
I
go back and
suggest
read
it.
To the Lighthouse again.
Yeah.
So when you finish a book like this, it must have been very intense to write. What is the after effect? How do you get ready for the next book? How do you know when it's time to start thinking about the next book?
Oh, I know. It's really hard, actually. I feel like until I sign off on the final manuscript, it's hard for me to think of anything else because I was so fully immersed in this like cold
Were there
surface.
many significant editing changes that occurred, or
There weren't. I will tell you the my editor's main suggestion was being clear about about Katerina, who is Anya's mother. And I know it's not even clear now, but it's more clear than it was before, and kind of giving that her a little more weight, and her story a little more weight than it had before. And that was great for me. I mean, sometimes you just need someone to say this isn't quite coming through, and but the story itself stayed pretty much pretty similar, other than small changes. My biggest fear was that readers of who lived in the Soviet Union, who had lived in the Soviet Union, would find fault. And so I did have people read it. Some people read it.
did this book make it to the Soviet Union,
It did
Russia?
not. It did not. There were discussions, but it was right. It's interesting. It was right close to when Russia invaded
Right,
Ukraine. Everything shut down. Anything
right.
having to do
Yeah, I
with
don't
that
think
shut
this book
down.
would be a popular one.
No,
This is not going to be on Putin's bookshelf.
no, I don't think so. I don't think so at all.
Well, we wish you
Exactly.
all the best going forward. Can you hold up a picture of the book again? Do you
Yeah.
take a look at this? It just came out in paperback, I understand as
Yes,
well,
it did.
but I love
Here's
the
some
hard
hardback.
copy.
Thank you.
Please, people, buy this book and read it because it has so much in it.
Thank
And
you.
we'll look forward to reading some of your other books in the past and some of the ones to come.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rae Meadows from
Appreciate it.
Brooklyn, New York.
Yay.
Thanks.